The screening room at Republic Studios had walls covered in burgundy fabric that absorbed sound like confession. 23 people sat in judgment that afternoon in 1952, but only one man's opinion would matter. The producers sat in the center of the third row, the seat everyone knew was his without being told. When Dean Martin finished his screen test and the lights came up, the producer laughed. It wasn't the warm laughter of appreciation, it wasn't even the nervous laughter of discomfort. It was the particular laugh of a man who wanted everyone to understand that what they'd just witnessed was beneath consideration. The laugh said, "This is amateur hour." The laugh said, "Who let this person waste my time?" The laugh said, "You should be embarrassed for trying." Dean Martin stood at the front of the room, still holding the pages he'd been asked to read. The spotlight had been turned off, but theatrical lighting has a way of lingering on a person, like heat from a closed oven. He was 35 years old, no longer young by Hollywood standards, wearing a suit that had been pressed too many times, carrying the specific weight of a man who'd already been told no by better people than this. The producer's laugh continued for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to establish dominance, long enough for others to understand they should join in, long enough to fill a resume with rejection. Then it stopped. Not because the producer had finished, but because Dean Martin's silence had somehow made the laughter sound different, made it echo wrongly, made it seem suddenly fragile like ice over deep water. Dean didn't react, and that was when the room began to change. In Hollywood's golden age, humiliation was currency and laughter was law. Studio heads had perfected the art of rejection through ridicule. It was cleaner than confrontation, more efficient than explanation. A well-placed laugh could end a career before it started, could send a message to everyone present about who belonged and who didn't, could establish hierarchy without contracts or titles. The system was deliberate. Young actors were brought into rooms like this not just to audition, but to learn their place. The laugh told them, "You exist at our pleasure." The laugh told them, "Gratitude is your only acceptable response." The laugh told them, "Even your failure is ours to shape." Most performers, faced with that laugh, did one of 3 things. They laughed along, desperate to show they could take a joke, that they weren't difficult, that they understood their position. They defended themselves, explaining their choices, their preparation, their potential, which only confirmed their amateur status. Or they crumbled, shoulders dropping, confidence evaporating, another casualty of a system that consumed talent like a furnace consumes wood. The producer in that screening room, let's call him Sterling, though that wasn't his name, had been using this technique for 15 years. He'd laughed at actors who went on to win Academy Awards and actors who went on to sell insurance. The quality of their performance didn't determine his response. The laugh was about power, not opinion. According to those who witnessed such moments, Sterling had a particular gift for calibrating his ridicule. Too harsh, and he'd seem cruel. Too soft, and he'd seem weak. But that perfect middle ground, dismissive without being aggressive, superior without being threatened, that was where Sterling lived. He'd laughed at Veronica Lake before she became Veronica Lake. He'd laughed at John Garfield when Garfield was still Julius Garfinkel from the Bronx. Each laugh was an investment in his own authority, a reminder that in Hollywood, talent meant nothing without permission. Dean Martin in 1952 was not yet Dean Martin. He was 8 years removed from Dino Crissetti of Steubenville, Ohio, but the distance felt shorter in rooms like this. He'd had moderate success as a nightclub singer, one half of a comedy team with Jerry Lewis that was doing well enough to attract attention, but not well enough to demand respect. He was in that dangerous middle space where you're known enough to have something to lose, but not known enough to be protected. The screen test had been for a supporting role in a film that would ultimately be forgotten. Dean didn't particularly want the part, but his agent had insisted, and Dean had learned that in Hollywood, you took the meetings, you did the tests, you smiled at the people who controlled the rooms, not because you believed in the system, but because the system was the only game in town. What Sterling didn't know What most of Hollywood didn't know was that Dean had already been laughed at by experts. His father had laughed at his singing dreams while pulling 14-hour shifts at the steel mill. The boxing promoters had laughed when he said he was quitting the ring to become an entertainer. The nightclub owners in Cleveland and Cincinnati had laughed before they heard him sing, and sometimes after. Dean had been shaped by laughter the way stone is shaped by water, slowly, invisibly, until what remains is either smooth enough to skip across surfaces or sharp enough to cut. But there was something else Sterling didn't know. Dean had spent 2 years working as a croupier in a mob-run casino in Ohio before his singing career began. He'd learned to read rooms the way sailors read weather, instinctively, constantly, as a matter of survival. He'd watched men win and lose fortunes on the turn of a card, seen power shift across a table in seconds, understood that the man making the most noise was rarely the man holding the best hand. Standing in that screening room, still holding the pages of a script he'd never think about again, Dean recognized Sterling's laugh for what it was, a bluff. Dean set the script pages on the small table beside him. The gesture was precise, unhurried. Paper against wood made the softest sound, but in the growing quiet of the room, it registered like punctuation. He didn't smile. That would have suggested he was in on the joke. He didn't frown. That would have suggested he was affected. He simply stood there, weight evenly distributed, hands at his sides, looking at Sterling with the kind of focus that made the producer suddenly aware he was being observed rather than performing. 5 seconds passed. In a screening room, 5 seconds of silence after expected laughter is eternity. It's long enough for everyone to understand that something has shifted, that the script they thought they were following has been abandoned. Sterling's laugh had created a vacuum that demanded filling. Every instinct, every social convention, every rule of Hollywood hierarchy insisted that Dean should speak, should thank them for their time, should make a self-deprecating joke, should somehow acknowledge the producer's authority. But Dean just stood there. His silence had a quality to it, not aggressive. Aggressive silence has its own energy, its own movement. This was something else. This was the silence of a man who'd simply decided not to participate in whatever was happening around him. 10 seconds. Sterling shifted in his seat. The leather creaked. In the acoustic perfection of the screening room, the sound was amplified, emphasized, almost embarrassing. Others in the room began to notice their own breathing. The assistant in the back row found himself staring at his notepad. The studio executive 2 seats from Sterling developed a sudden interest in his wristwatch. 15 seconds. Private accounts from that day described the sensation differently. One said it was like watching a timer count down to something no one wanted to reach. Another said it felt like the moment before a glass falls from a table, inevitable, irreversible, already broken in your mind. Sterling cleared his throat. The sound was meant to break the spell, to reassert control, to remind everyone who ran this room. But in the silence Dean had created, it sounded like what it was: discomfort. "Well," Sterling began, but his voice came out wrong, too high, too quick. He stopped, cleared his throat again, tried to recapture his earlier authority. "I think we've seen enough." It was a dismissal. In any other circumstance, the auditioner would have nodded, thanked them, left quickly. The meeting would end with Sterling's authority intact, even enhanced. But Dean didn't move. What happened next would be described years later by an assistant director who was present as watching gravity change direction. Dean finally moved, but not toward the door. He walked 3 steps to his left, picked up his jacket from where he'd placed it on a chair. He put it on slowly, deliberately, the way a man dresses when he's alone in his own bedroom. He adjusted the collar, straightened the sleeves, every movement precise, unhurried, complete. The room watched him dress. 23 people, including one of the most powerful producers at Republic Studios, sat in silence, watching Dean Martin put on a jacket as if it were the most important act in the world. When he was satisfied with how the jacket sat on his shoulders, Dean walked to the door. Not quickly, not slowly, the walk of a man who decided to leave at his own convenience. At the door, he stopped. For a moment, everyone thought he would speak, would deliver some cutting remark, some vindication, some acknowledgement of what had just happened. Instead, Dean turned just his head, not his body, just his head, and looked back at Sterling. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Those who saw it would struggle to describe it later. It wasn't contempt, it wasn't anger, it wasn't triumph. It was the look you might give a chair you'd bumped into, a brief acknowledgement of something that had momentarily been in your way but wasn't worth remembering. Then he opened the door and left. The soft click of the door closing was the loudest sound anyone had heard. For exactly 3 seconds, no one moved. Then the assistant director stood and followed Dean out, not to chase him, not to apologize, but simply because staying in that room suddenly felt like being complicit in something shameful. Another executive stood, then a script reader. One by one, without coordination, without discussion, people began leaving the room. They didn't look at Sterling as they left. They didn't look at each other. They moved like people leaving a funeral where something inappropriate had been said, quickly, quietly, eager to be anywhere else. Within 90 seconds, Sterling was alone in the screening room with 2 studio executives who wouldn't meet his eyes. "What the hell just happened?" Sterling asked. No one answered, because what had happened was both simple and incomprehensible. Dean Martin had taken Sterling's laughter, his weapon, his authority, his carefully cultivated power, and made it irrelevant. Not by fighting it, not by countering it, but by treating it as something that didn't require response. Sterling sat in the empty screening room for another 5 minutes, though it would feel like hours in his memory. He understood, with the kind of clarity that comes too late to matter, what had gone wrong. His laugh had been designed to diminish Dean, to establish Sterling's position as the arbiter of value in that room. But Dean's silence had revealed something Sterling had never considered. His authority only existed if others agreed to recognize it. The laugh had been a transaction that required Dean's participation, either through anger, submission, or desperation. By refusing all 3, Dean had left Sterling performing a one-man show about power to an audience that had stopped believing in the performance. According to those close to Sterling, he never quite recovered from that afternoon. Not professionally. He would continue producing films for another decade, but something fundamental had shifted. He became hesitant in meetings, second-guessing his instincts, wondering if his next laugh would land or hang in the air like smoke from a fire that had already been extinguished. He would sometimes tell the story himself years later, after enough drinks to make honesty feel safe, but he would change it. In his version, Dean had said something clever, had delivered a comeback that put Sterling in his place, had fought back with words that Sterling could then dismiss or accept. He never told the truth, that Dean had said nothing. Because how do you explain being defeated by silence? How do you describe losing a battle that was never engaged? How do you admit that your carefully constructed authority could be dismantled by a man simply putting on his jacket and leaving? Not everyone could have done what Dean did that afternoon. Frank Sinatra couldn't have managed it. Frank's power came from volatility, from the constant threat of explosion. His silence would have read as the calm before violence, would have escalated rather than deflated. Frank needed to be heard to be powerful. Sammy Davis Jr. couldn't have done it. As a black performer in white Hollywood, silence from Sammy would have been interpreted as submission, as knowing his place. He'd learned early that he had to fill every silence with talent, charm, proof of his right to be in the room. Even most established stars couldn't have done it. They'd been trained by the studio system to perform gratitude, to treat every opportunity as a gift requiring acknowledgement. Their contracts might have made them rich, but their reflexes kept them obedient. But Dean occupied a unique psychological position. He'd grown up poor enough to know that dignity didn't require money. He'd been a fighter, understanding physical conflict well enough to recognize that most fights were lost in the mind before a punch was thrown. He dealt cards in illegal games where reading silence was the difference between winning and being broken. Most importantly, Dean had something rarer than talent or connections. He genuinely didn't care. This wasn't indifference as pose or protection. This was authentic disinterest in the approval of people he didn't respect. Sterling's laughter meant nothing to Dean because Sterling meant nothing to Dean. The job meant nothing. The room meant nothing. The entire apparatus of Hollywood approval that most actors spent their lives pursuing was, to Dean, just noise. Industry insiders would later describe this quality as Dean's superpower. In a town built on need, the need to be seen, to be loved, to be validated, Dean seemed to need nothing from anyone. He enjoyed success when it came. He survived failure when it arrived, but neither defined him in the way it defined his peers. This made his silence dangerous, because silence from someone desperate is submission. Silence from someone angry is threat. But silence from someone who simply doesn't care? That's erasure. That's looking through someone as if they're made of glass. That's the kind of dismissal from which egos never quite recover. Word of what happened in the screening room spread through Hollywood the way secrets do, whispered, distorted, but essentially true. Dean never got the part. Sterling made sure of that. But something more interesting happened. Dean started getting other offers, better offers, from producers who'd heard about the screening room and wanted to work with someone who couldn't be diminished by laughter. Sterling's reputation underwent a subtle but significant shift. He was still powerful, still capable of getting films made, but there was something different in how people responded to him. They were polite but not deferential, professional but not personal. It was as if the entire industry had unconsciously agreed that Sterling was someone to work with but not someone to respect. He began to notice it in small ways. Meetings that used to come to him now required him to travel. Calls that used to be returned immediately now took days. The best scripts went to other producers first. The most talented directors developed scheduling conflicts. According to private accounts, Sterling tried to laugh it off, his default response to any challenge. But the laughter sounded hollow now, like an echo of authority rather than authority itself. People would smile politely and change the subject. The laugh that had once ended conversations now ended nothing. Dean, meanwhile, never spoke publicly about that afternoon. When asked years later about his early career struggles, he would mention the odd jobs, the failed auditions, the years of uncertainty. But he never mentioned Sterling, never mentioned the screening room, never mentioned the moment when a producer's laughter met his silence. It wasn't discretion, it wasn't kindness, it was something more devastating. Genuine forgetfulness. To Dean, the incident hadn't been significant enough to remember. Sterling had been just another man in another room making another noise that didn't matter. Years later, when Dean Martin was one of the most successful entertainers in America, a young comedian asked him for advice about dealing with rejection. "Everyone's going to laugh at you," Dean said, swirling whiskey in a glass he wouldn't drink from. "That's the job, making people laugh." "But what about when they're laughing at you, not with you?" the comedian asked. Dean smiled, that easy, crooked smile that had made him millions. "Here's the thing about laughter," he said. "It needs an audience. You take away the audience, and it's just some guy making noise in an empty room." The comedian didn't understand, not then. It would take him years to realize what Dean meant, that laughter, like all exercises of power, required participation. It needed someone to hear it, to acknowledge it, to be diminished by it. Without that acknowledgement, laughter was just sound, and sound, without meaning, was just noise. Sterling learned this too late. He'd believed that his position gave his laughter weight, that his authority made his ridicule significant. But authority isn't inherent, it's granted, and it can be revoked not through rebellion or confrontation, but through the simple act of refusing to acknowledge its existence. Dean Martin had understood something that afternoon in the screening room that most people never learn. The most powerful response to someone trying to make you small isn't to make yourself bigger, it's to make them invisible, to look through their performance as if it isn't happening, to treat their carefully constructed superiority as something too insignificant to notice. In Hollywood's careful hierarchy, where every interaction was about establishing position, Dean had found the ultimate power move: refusing to play. Not fighting the game, not changing the rules, simply walking away from the board as if it had never mattered. The producer thought laughter established dominance, but dominance requires submission, and submission requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires caring enough to respond. Dean gave him none of these things. Instead, he gave him silence. Perfect, complete, devastating silence. The kind that made Sterling's laughter echo in an empty room long after everyone had left. The kind that transformed a weapon into weight. The kind that turned a man accustomed to controlling rooms into a man sitting alone, wondering when everyone had stopped listening. Because in the end, that's what Dean understood and Sterling didn't. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with laughter or threats or demonstrations of authority. Real power is quiet. It's the ability to make someone realize their noise means nothing. It's the capacity to turn a room with silence. It's the knowledge that you can leave whenever you choose, and that leaving is sometimes the most powerful thing you can do. The producer thought laughter made him powerful. Dean Martin knew that silence decides who stays. And in Hollywood, where everyone was performing all the time, the man who could stop performing, who could stand in perfect stillness while others exhausted themselves with noise, that man didn't just win the room, he made the room irrelevant, which was, perhaps, the most dangerous power of all.